Now for the main event. Again, the resolution reads, the stagnation of living standards and soaring economic inequality have become the defining economic trends of American life. Here for the affirmative, I bring you David Leonhardt. David, please come to the stage. For the negative, I bring you John Early. John, please come to the stage. Jane, again, please close the voting. You have 5 more seconds to vote yes, no, or undecided on the resolution. Voting closed. David, you have 17 and a half minutes to defend the resolution. You probably want to take the podium. Take it away, David.
Good evening, everyone. I have some slides, I think. Is that right? There they are. Hello, everybody. I want to start by thanking Jane and thanking Jean and thanking John for doing this evening and inviting me here. And I also really want to echo what Nick said about how important it is, particularly in these moments of polarization. I just want to echo what Nick said about how important it is that we have fora for respectful but real disagreements. In a democracy, we have to have disagreements. It's sort of the point of having a democracy. We don't inherit policies from the government and just decide that we like them. We're supposed to argue about them. We're supposed to argue about the state of our country. And we haven't forgotten how to argue in this country, but I do think we've sometimes forgotten how to argue in a way that conveys both real disagreement, but also respect for the other side. And I'm really pleased to have a chance to do this tonight with John in front of all of you, and we're both looking forward to hearing your questions once we lay out our cases. So I've just written a book about the American dream, which you can see on the screen here, which I think is a big part of why Jean asked me to be part of this debate tonight. And I actually want to start by defining the American dream using the original definition, which is now nearly a century old, because I think that frame offers a way to think about our resolution tonight, which Jean has already covered nicely. So the idea of the American dream and really the coining of the phrase comes from 1931, from a book called The Epic of America by an independent historian based here in New York named James Truslow Adams. He'd made enough money on Wall Street that he could stop trading and instead write books, and he did very well as a historian. He won a Pulitzer Prize. And his book, Epic of America, in 1931, he included this new idea of that American dream, as he called it, of a better, richer, happier life for all of our citizens of every rank. And he called it the greatest contribution we, by which he meant the United States, has yet made to the world. And I think there are really 3 key ideas in that definition. So the first is progress, better, richer, happier. Adams didn't say exactly better, richer, happier than what, but I think it's implicit. He said the idea is that over time, people can enjoy better, richer, happier lives, and they can expect that their children will enjoy better, richer, happier lives than they did. Over the march of time, life gets better. That's progress. The second part of the definition is social mobility, all our citizens of every rank. And I think that is in part subtly a contrast with Europe. The idea that it doesn't matter the station in which you are born in the United States, you can expect to have a better, richer, happier life. And the last part of the definition is this idea that it's distinctive to the United States. It's quite a lovely notion, and it's worth focusing for a minute on the last word on that slide, 1931. He came up with this idea at really the nadir of the Great Depression in this country. It's more than 2 years after the stock market crash, and the country won't begin to pull out of the Depression for several more years. And yet he conveyed a real long-term sense of optimism about the country. And I want to use his definition to speak a little bit about our resolution tonight. And I want to focus on his 3 words of better, richer, and happier. And I'm going to take them one at a time. I'm going to take them in a slightly different order than he did. I'm going to start with richer. And I want to use them to focus on this question of stagnation, which is a word in our resolution, and inequality, which is another word in our resolution. So let's start with richer. And I actually think the idea that Americans have become richer is the strongest piece of evidence and the strongest argument for the other side of the debate. Americans are not poorer than they were a decade ago. They are not poorer than they were a couple decades ago. But the typical American isn't much richer either when you look at the data. So as you can see on this slide here, what I've got as kind of a benchmark in that bold line is per capita GDP. So that is basically what as a society, our whole economy is producing. And what you can see is that for the very rich in our society, they have made progress at a much, much faster pace than our economy as a whole. The economy has grown a certain amount, and people at the top, and particularly at the very top, have had their incomes, this is after taxes and government benefits, have had their incomes grow much, much more than the economy as a whole. People in the middle have had their incomes grow somewhat more slowly than the economy as a whole, and the bottom 50% has had it grown substantially more slowly than the economy as a whole. And in some ways, I think it comes down to the richer part of this. How should we feel about those lines at the bottom? Is that good enough that people should be happy? And they should say, you know what? The American economy has been great for me. It has not been stagnant. And I think the answer is no. I think Americans are reasonably frustrated by the pace of their incomes. Here's another way to look at it. That again is per capita GDP. You can see median family income trailing GDP, and you can see the pay of top corporate executives vastly exceeding GDP. These two charts I've just shown you come from two different academic studies, very well-regarded academics. This is from a professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. The last one was professors at Berkeley. So let's now look at different data in case you don't trust those academic professors. This comes from the Census Bureau. Now we're on a different scale, not percentage change, but we're looking at income levels over time adjusted for inflation. And I would ask you, when you look at the median and you look at the 10th percentile, does that look like stagnation to you? It certainly looks like stagnation to me. Yes, the point of the line at the end is a little bit higher than it was at the beginning. But that is really slow growth. And you can also see the inequality in this chart. The income at the 95th percentile has increased much more. If I was able to get the 99th or 99.9th percentile from the Census Bureau, I would have to expand the chart to show how much it has risen. Here's the Fed, and I'm now switching from income to wealth. Once again, you really have to squint to notice that for most Americans, those in the middle and at the bottom, it has gone up at all. To me, this is pretty strong evidence, or quite strong evidence, for both stagnation and inequality. And just again to point out, it isn't even the strongest evidence. The strongest evidence for stagnation and for inequality, which in our resolution is not simply economic, it is broader than that, is in the non-economic variables. Here's another way to think about it. A child who was born in 1940, she or he had a 92% chance to grow up and make more than her or his parents earned at the same time, the same age. So if you're born in 1940, achieving the American dream by the richer part of it was a virtual guarantee. Even if you went through a divorce, even if you were laid off, as many workers were in the middle of the 20th century, even if you had a health crisis, the odds that you would out-earn your parents were very, very good. This is a paper from the journal Science, a team of professors at Harvard and elsewhere. For a child born in 1980, the odds were only 50%, a coin flip. Again, strong signs of stagnation. So let me come back to the resolution. The stagnation of living standards and soaring economic inequality have become the defining economic trends of American life. You look back at those charts, every one of them shows stagnation for most people and inequality overall. I want to add one point here, which is there are a couple data series that I didn't show you that would have made things look even worse, that would have made wages look as if they had declined for most Americans. I consider those series outliers. There are also some outliers that say if you change the inflation adjustments and use a different one from what the federal government used, everything looks great for Americans. I'm showing you the bulk of the evidence, the Census Bureau, the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, the economists publishing in top academic journals. They're all deeply consistent with this notion. Now let's turn to happier. Are Americans happier than they were? How do they feel about the stagnation that is a central part of our political and economic life today? Well, it has been nearly 20 years since a majority of Americans said the country was on the right track. This is from Gallup. We're now down about 20% of Americans who say the country is on the right track. Think about that. Whether the economy is growing or shrinking, whether we have a Republican president or a Democratic president, a strong majority of Americans do not believe the country is headed in the right direction. People are not happy about the direction of the country. What about their own lives? Here's a headline from Gallup. Less than half of Americans very satisfied with their own lives. You can see that is basically the lowest level since Gallup has been doing this over the last couple decades. This isn't just what they say about the country, it's also what they say about their own lives. Here's a question from Pew in which they said, is it still possible to achieve the American dream? Which is a phenomenally low bar. I've written a book about how the American dream is threatened. I would say yes to this question. It is certainly still possible to achieve the American dream. Look at that age breakdown. The yellow is no, and the tan is yes. And what you see is that older Americans who benefited from an economy of earlier decades say that yes, it's still possible to achieve the American dream. Younger Americans, those under 50, as a majority say it isn't possible to achieve the American dream. A poll from ABC News, which instead asks it a little bit, puts a higher bar. Is the American dream a reality? Finds that a strong majority of Americans say that no, it is not a reality, and that the number who think it's a reality has shrunk really substantially over the last couple decades. I love the fact that we are at a forum that celebrates free minds and free people, because one of the central ideas of libertarianism is that we should trust people. We shouldn't have the government or experts or elites telling people what they should believe. We should listen to them and believe that they are right. And so if we listen to Americans and we ask them, how do you feel about your living standards? Do you think they are satisfactory or are they stagnating? They come back with very clear answers. No, they are not satisfactory, and yes, they are stagnating. And if you sometimes wonder, well, wait a second, what am I really supposed to think about these poll numbers? I would rather think about it in a more vibesy sense. Are Americans happy or not with the state of our economy? That's my response. They are not happy. The Republican Party is traditionally the party that is supposed to be uplifting about the United States of America. The Democrats are the downers who talk about how bad inequality is. 8 years ago, Donald Trump took over the Republican Party, and he has dominated it ever since with a message that is quite clearly about the idea that Americans should not be satisfied with the condition of our country. He talks about carnage. There's a clip of him you can find online where he says, the American dream is dead. His running mate, J.D. Vance, is very much of this same school. So when the voters of the two parties are picking candidates, they are picking candidates who reflect back to them their own belief that living standards in this country are growing at an unacceptably slow pace, and that the fact that some people are doing better than others is a major problem. Stagnation and inequality. Think about how much Donald Trump talks about elites. Think about how much Kamala Harris and Tim Walz talk about taxing rich people and about corporate price gouging. This is what people are feeling, and this is what the political leaders who our voters choose are reflecting back to them. The final thing I want to talk about is better. Is everyone just wrong? Have the trends of the last few decades been so wonderful that we should just tell Americans to stop whining? And in fact, there isn't stagnation here and things are going great. And when I think about this question, I try to think about it sort of fulsomely. And I've even made a list of things that have gotten better and not gotten better over the last couple decades. There are certainly things that have gotten better. Access to information is better than it used to be. I think religious discrimination in most ways is less of a problem than it used to be, as are other forms of discrimination, racial and gender discrimination. These are all still problems, but I think they're less than they used to be. The air we breathe is cleaner than it used to be. Crime in most cities is lower, although it's come up again recently. But there are also a whole bunch of things that are worse. We have many more extreme storms, as Florida is experiencing. We have a lot of gun violence. We've made less progress than other countries in dealing with vehicle fatalities. Drug overdoses are a much bigger problem than they used to be. Mass incarceration is a bigger problem than it used to be. Chronic pain is a bigger problem. Diabetes. I think our democracy in some ways is weaker than it used to be. So the question is, how do we weigh all these things and think about overall, is life getting better or is it not? Well, I think we should look at the very most important things, the way people live their lives, their basic health, their family structure. And I think in the really biggest ways, there are reasons to feel very alarmed about the state of American society and to believe that it has indeed stagnated and in even some ways have gone backwards. These are rates of loneliness and mental health problems among young people. They were rising even before COVID. If I updated this chart all the way, it would look even worse. Americans are much more likely to feel lonely. Our children are much more likely to have mental health problems than they used to. In terms of teen mental health, we haven't stagnated, we've gone backwards. This is the percentage of children who live with two parents. And I don't in any way want to demean single parents. They are heroic figures. My grandmother raised my dad as a single mom. But as a society, we're better off if more kids grow up with two parents rather than one. That's not an area where we've merely stagnated. We've actually moved backwards in terms of the number of kids who grow up with two parents. What about people's decision about whether to have kids? One of the biggest expressions of confidence in our future that you could possibly make. Our fertility rate has absolutely plunged in this country. And then there is what might be the single best measure of society's health overall, which is how long do people live? In 1980, as you can see at the beginning of this chart, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. This shows every rich country in the world life expectancy at birth. The US is the red line. At the beginning, you can see it's sort of in the middle. Japan and Portugal are just included as examples. Our life expectancy in the 1980s started to grow more slowly than in any other rich country in the world. By the early part of the 21st century, we had the worst life expectancy of any country in the world. You can see today, it's not even particularly close. There is no other rich country that has a life expectancy that is close to ours. We're by far the worst off of rich countries in terms of life expectancy. This trend is driven overwhelmingly by the stagnation in life expectancy for people who don't have a four-year college degree. The big dip at the end of this chart is COVID. It's going to bounce back from COVID. But you can see from that chart, this isn't just a COVID story or anywhere close, and other countries are also going to bounce back. So let me just put a fine point on that. We're talking about stagnation in living standards in a country that now has the single worst life expectancy of any rich country in the world and has for almost 20 years, and it isn't especially close. I think the answer for our society has to be to acknowledge people's frustration, acknowledge their anger, not to tell them that they are wrong about stagnation or inequality, but to take this country's enormous strengths, frankly, that no other country in the world has, and use them to fix what is indeed the defining problem of modern American life. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, David. John Early for the negative. You get an extra 20 seconds because David took an extra 20. So take it away, John.
I'll just talk faster. Okay. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for asking me, Gene, and David, thanks for joining, making this a much more interesting environment. And thank you all for coming. I look forward to your feedback and questions at the end here. Let's revisit what our proposition is. The stagnation of living standards and soaring economic inequality are the defining trends. Two statements of fact. So let's work our way through those. This is the income distribution as published by the United States Census Bureau of households. Organized by quintiles, or fifths of the population. And as you can see, it runs from roughly 15,000 to a little over 200,000. And that is the differences in income as the Census Bureau defines it. And that difference is 16.7 times bigger at the top than it is at the bottom. Now that has two components: earned income from working and from savings, and transfer income, which is money the government gives to people, not in exchange for any work. Now, the earned income that census does also is missing some pieces that I want to talk about first, because we engaged, two colleagues and I engaged in the activity that resulted in a book. And we fixed these numbers because census doesn't count the capital gains, which are prominent at the top end of the income distribution. It does not count employer-paid benefits, which affect everybody, and it does not count certain other low and underreported items in the low income. So when we fix those, actually the distribution looks bigger, looks worse. But then there's the transfer payments. Census says there's this much, but they miss 2/3 of it. What do they miss? They miss food stamps. They miss refundable tax credits. They miss the federal government paying for the health care of lower income people. When we add all of those in, it looks like this, which is then a difference of 5 to 1, okay, 5.7 to 1. So we've eliminated 2/3 of the inequality simply by counting all the income. But we also need to look at how much taxes are taken away. So here in the red is what the taxes take away. Taxes take away 35% of the income of the upper earners. It takes away 7.5% of those at the lower end, and that dashed line is the income after transfers and taxes. And you can see that the difference between top and bottom got a whole lot smaller when we count everything, only 4 to 1. In other words, what we believe, what we are told day after day by the politicians and by the official announcements from government is that our income is very unequal. In fact, it's not all that unequal. 4 to 1 doesn't sound so bad. But in any case, we should talk about the 4 to 1, not the 16 to 1, whether you think it's bad or not. But there's another element to this as well. As look at the bottom 3 quintiles, the 60% at the lowest end of the income scale all essentially have the same level of income. Now I'm going to put this on a different chart just so you can see it a little more easily. So that's each quintiles or each fifth's income. And as you can see, the income for the bottom 3s, they're each quite close. But that's not the end of the story. People who analyze these data usually make a size adjustment for the size of the household. Lower income households tend to have 1.5 people per household. The upper end tends to have 3.5. When you make that adjustment, the difference is only 2.7 to 1. So there's not a huge difference in the welfare of our households based on their economic performance. And what's important here to note as well is that how they get to that point is different. Adults of prime work age in the bottom quintile today, 2/3 of them do not work. And I don't mean they don't work some days, they don't work any time at all during a year, 2/3. And look at what they get for their income. Adjusted for size, lower income, the bottom quintile, actually has 5% more income than the second quintile. And the third quintile has only 7% more than the bottom. And not only is this income not different, the way they got there is very different. As I said, the bottom quintile, 2/3 of the people don't work. But in the second and third quintiles, almost all of the prime work age adults work. And there are 2 to 3 times as many adults work in those quintiles than in the bottom. And they work 2 times more hours per week. So what's happening here is the bottom 60% of the population has essentially the same income, but it's because government has taken the taxes from the upper end and redistributed it to the lower end. And that has created the fact that we now have 2/3 of our prime work age adults not working in the lower quintile because they accepted the government's offer not to work. Now, there's another way to measure this, and it's called the Gini index. Now, Gini is not some critter in a bottle that gives us our wishes. This is a guy's name. And it's a measure which says at 0, we have perfect equality. All households have the same income. At 1, perfect inequality. All the incomes in one household. And this has been around for years, and there are other measures that are similar, but they tell the same thing. And Census has published it, and here we see it drifting up over the last 70 years. And people believe that this is true. But what do we know about it? This 23% increase in inequality as measured by Census isn't counting the transfer payments. It isn't adjusted for the taxes. If we do that, lo and behold, not only does it not climb, it actually has drifted down slightly. And that's a fact. Now let's take a look at one of the charts that was in David's book. I took the data from it on the left-hand side, and it shows the percent changes over since 1960 in the 10th, the 25th, the 50th, and the 90th percentiles. And that tells the story that he was talking about. But the data came from Gabriel Zuckman, and I know that data well. They don't count most of the transfer payments. And if you count all the transfer payments and adjust for the taxes, you get the distribution now over on the right-hand side, okay? And we see that it's the bottom that has grown the fastest. Now, why is that? It's because transfer payments, money the government gives to people, has grown since 1967 by 900%. In other words, people were giving away 10 times as many dollars to the lower income groups, and the result is fewer of them work. And so that is one of the reasons why we have all this negative effects. People are dropping out of the labor force and living on government transfer payments, and so we get some of those adverse social effects. Okay. Now this is average hourly earnings, which is one of the series that David referred to but didn't actually show. And it shows what it looks like might be stagnation. And this is adjusted for inflation. But it's not the whole story. First of all, it doesn't count the 1/4 of the compensation people get from their employer that's not wages and salaries, healthcare benefits and so on. Secondly, it doesn't include the self-employed and the entrepreneurs, the people that create something out of nothing. Those people aren't included here. And most important, it doesn't adjust using the best available price index. It uses a CPIU, and now there's a better index that the BLS has published for the last 22 years, that if you use that for the adjustment, we would see that instead of a 20% rise, we would have like a 50% rise. So that is a statistical problem that we need to fix. And it is fixed. It exists. The data exists, but it just gets ignored. But beyond that, there's still more improvements that need to be made to the CPI. And I kind of have a personal knowledge of this. I used to run the program, so I know where the skeletons are. But if we adjust for other things that need to be fixed in the CPI, we would get an increase of more than 100% since 1964. And this isn't just some hypothetical, mythological problem. This actually comes out of 3 different government blue ribbon panels: the Stigler panel, the Boskin, and the Bowles. not to mention Alan Greenspan when he was at the Fed. Because using the right index makes a whole lot of difference. But now let's turn to the series that's actually probably most important for us right now. And that is, this is now median household income. Okay, this is really the measure of economic welfare. And originally, census was using the basic CPIU, and that dashed black line, the dashed black line at the bottom there, is what it would look like adjusted for that. But then they moved on to a better index that BLS produced but didn't publish regularly. And finally, they moved to using the changed CPI, which is the one I showed you in the previous slide. And in this case, we see again, once again, we get a substantially greater increase when we count the price changes right. What happens is the old indexes that they're using do not count the price changes right. And if we make the fixes, it again gets us up over 100%. So we are deceiving ourselves by using these deficient indexes. Now, the key here is the better index is used in two places. One is right here, census is using it, and the other is in the adjustment of the tax brackets. Otherwise, people just completely ignore it. Okay, let's see here. I want to talk just briefly about this one here. This is one that David had. And yes, this is how much people think things are going the right way. And it looks pretty flat since, you know, about 29 there, which is the bottom of the fiscal crisis, okay? Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you keep this signs up so I can see the signs?
Time out for some water.
Now, I've got two things to say about this kind of measure. First of all, first of all, this measure is not what we're debating. We're debating people's attitudes. I mean, that's what we're talking about when we're looking at this. But the proposition is income inequality has soared and has stagnated, and income or prosperity has stagnated. This is people's attitude. And people's attitudes are important, but they're not the same facts as the actual financial data show. So we've had three lows in this. One was back in 1979 and 1980. Well, in other words, it was at a low back at the point where David was pointing things have gotten worse since. But then it proceeded to peak in 1986, which is what? Right in the middle of the Reagan administration, the second administration of Reagan. It peaked again at the end of Clinton's administration, and it peaked again in the first administration of George Bush. Those were the highs, and it then declined since. But we're talking about long-term trends here. It goes up, it goes down, and you'll notice there, coming out of the financial crisis, very slow improvement until we hit the Trump days. It boosted up, and then we hit COVID, and of course, it went to hell. But the point is, this is not a real economic measure, but it moves with the real economic measures in many ways. So what we got to remember here is we're talking about how unequal is income and has it stagnated? And the answer is, if we use the right data, if we count all the transfer payments, if we adjust for taxes, there is no serious stagnation. And the inequality, if anything, has gotten less. Those are facts. And we, in a book that I wrote with some of my colleagues, we go through pulling the data out and assembling it and putting in the missing transfer payments, subtracting the taxes. These are data that actually exist in government statistical bases, but they're not used for calculating the income. So that's what's important. Remember what we're looking at here is did economic conditions stagnate, And did economic conditions become more unequal? Well, the answer to both of those is no, it doesn't. Okay, let's look at life expectancy. Somehow I knew David was going to talk about this one. So this is the chart from his book. And it's true, it's distressing. But there's another explanation on which I've written another 200-page book. And it looks like this. Okay, here I've moved it up into the upper right-hand corner there, and I'm drawing a red line along it so we can keep it highlighted. Now, I've seen this before because I've written about it before. What's missing? History. Come on, there we go. Pre-1960, roughly. Look at what happens. All of a sudden, it's slowed down. Look at the trend. The trend before 1960 is the dashed black line. After 1960, it's the green line. It takes a right turn. Why? Government got in the way. And it was triggered by Sputnik. In 1957, the United States started spending like a drunken sailor on science. It quadrupled the spending of NIH. The consequence of that was NIH began to drive out private research. And it crowded it away both in terms of hiring away people to do the work and doing the work that had the most interesting effects. And as a result, people couldn't do it. And often violating scientific principles. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit that. And that's what drove the rate of improvement down, because all of a sudden our scientific research was not focused on solving problems, but on hiring scientists.
You've used your rest of 20 seconds.
Oh, that's all right.
John?
That's a good conclusion.
I think you made your statement. Thank you. And the rebuttal now comes from David, 7.5 minutes. You can take the podium if you'd like. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John. Okay, so I know how tiring it can be to listen to two people talk to you about economic statistics, and one says the line's going up and one says the line's going down, and you're left there thinking, what am I supposed to make of this? How can both of these things be true? What I would say briefly about the economic statistics themselves, but then I want to try to give you a way to think about them, even if you leave this somewhat confused, is the bulk of the evidence out there is strongly consistent with my argument. You will recall I showed you data from the Census Bureau. I showed you data from the Federal Reserve. There's identical data from the Congressional Budget Office. John actually showed you data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I showed you 3 different academic papers, one of which in fact does include the vast majority of taxes and transfers, that very first one showing massive rises of inequality. John did some really interesting work with 2 colleagues and published it, but if what you're trying to line up is the bulk of the evidence, what we're getting from official government statistics or from John's work, I would say the bulk of the evidence quite strongly is on the side of multiple government agencies, multiple academic works that have gone through peer review rather than a single study. I would also say that it is true that some people argue that there are alternate inflation adjustments out there, and they make everything in our economy look absolutely wonderful over the last few decades. They're not actually the measures that our government has adopted when they are measuring incomes, and I still think it makes more sense to use the measures that our government is actually using in all kinds of ways. But as I said, I recognize that you all here, and I frankly don't have a PhD in economics, you're not going to be able to sort through all these things at once. So when I am left with dueling studies, one of the things I try to do is figure out where's the weight of the evidence. Are there much more studies that have gone through peer review and coming through official sources? But I don't stop there. I also seek to use logic to figure out how I think about these things. And I would encourage all of you to use logic when you think about these things? Which of these statistics is more likely to be true? So John showed you a statistic at one point that suggested the gap between wealthy people and poor people in the United States in income is a ratio of 4 to 1. And then later showed you a second slide that suggested that the gap was actually closer to 3 to 1. Go around, walk around New York City or walk around another city. Does it feel like the ratio of people making a lot of money to people making very little money is 3 to 1 or 4 to 1? Or does it feel like it's much larger? Does it feel like the kind of ratios you saw in the charts that I showed you? I think it feels like the ratio between people making a lot of money and not a lot of money is much, much greater than 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, in addition to the huge amount of evidence from published academic work that's gone through peer review and government statistics. John's statistics also suggested that the bottom 4 quintiles, there's not much difference between an upper middle class American family after you take into account taxes and transfers and a poor American family. Walk around the suburbs of our country and then walk around poor rural or poor urban areas. Does it feel like their income is actually quite similar once you take into account taxes and transfers? It doesn't to me. I don't think it does to most people. And then once we get beyond the economic statistics, I agree that we are debating reality here more than perceptions. But the language of the resolution says defining issue of our time. And the question when we have these dueling economic statistics, mine that show people have reason to be frustrated, and John that suggests actually they should feel great about the economic trends of the last few decades is, what do we do about the fact that people tell us they're frustrated? They tell us they think things in this country have stagnated. And then what do we do with the data that doesn't depend on which inflation adjustment you use? Data like life expectancy, data like the condition of our families. All of that points very strongly toward stagnation and toward inequality being a huge deal. Remember what I showed you about the gap in life expectancy having grown so much between people who have a 4-year college degree and people who don't. That is a story of inequality. John ended by arguing that government policy is at fault here. And the nice thing about this debate is we actually don't have to sort through that debate. You can absolutely agree that government policy is the reason for the stagnation. You can buy John's argument that Sputnik and the funding of science and big government is the reason why things have turned around over the last few decades. But you know what he was arguing there at the end? He was arguing that things have stagnated because of Sputnik and because of big government. Think about it. We were doing better than other countries until the mid to late 20th century. Since then, we've been doing much, much worse. And the reason we've been doing much, much worse is overwhelmingly driven by trends in the bottom 2/3 of our distribution. So what's another way to say we've been doing much, much worse? Things aren't really getting better that rapidly. They aren't getting better as rapidly as they used to, as John's own slide showed. Another way to describe that is stagnation. And what's another way to say that those life expectancy trends, like so many of the other trends, are being driven because of a growing gap between people who don't have a 4-year degree and people do, or pick any other dividing line? Another way to describe that is inequality. So whether you look at the bulk of the economic evidence, or whether you look at what Americans are telling us about how they experience it, or whether you look at the data about how people's actual lives are functioning, living standards, as are the words in our debate, you can see that stagnation and inequality are defining issues of our time, and we should trust Americans when they tell us that they are. Thank you.
Thank you, David. 7.5 minutes for your rebuttal. Take it away, John.
The proposition we are debating has to do with objective fact, not how people feel about them, which is an important thing to talk about, but that's not what our topic is. Our question is there more income inequality, and have the economic status of Americans stagnated? I don't know, can you put my slides back up again? Maybe not. I don't see anybody back there. Okay. But what's important here are several things. David suggested that if we're confused by the details, we should look around us and see how we feel. Well, that's not a good scientific standard, okay? Because the first thing we got to do is get the facts. Then we can say, how do we feel about the facts? For example, if we walk around and we do in fact see variations in people's living standards, and just to be clear, I said that the bottom 3, not the bottom 4 quintiles were essentially the same. Yeah, let me go here real quick and see if I can find the one I'm looking for. Okay, here we go. Okay, this is the income distribution in 1967. And the top blue is the top quintile, and the red is the bottom, and the others are the income levels at which each of those quintiles exist. Now, how does that compare with today? If you look at that today, we see that the top quintile in 1967 had the same incomes that now inhabit the top, 4th, middle, and almost all of the second quintile. In other words, 77% of the population in the United States today has incomes that only the top 20% had back in 1967. That is a fact. That's government data. Remember, the data that Phil and Bob and I put together was not our data. It was other government data that census just does not use. It's there. Here's the refundable tax credits. They could put that in as income, which we did. We went to the census sample, the 80,000 households, and we inserted the refundable tax credits that they got, which census doesn't count, and which Zuckman doesn't count either. Okay, so they don't count them. But when we count them all, today, 77% of the population makes incomes that would have put them in the top 20% 50 years ago. That is progress. Now, there have been ups and downs, as I showed you with people's satisfaction with it. At different points in time, different policies have made people happy. But one of the things that makes them unhappy is when I'm working 45 hours a week and my wife is working 45 hours a week, and we look down the road and Joe and Mary are not working at all, but their income is only $2,000 or $3,000 different from ours. I say, that's not fair. I'm unhappy. That's what's motivating some of this unhappiness. You know, David wants to talk about unhappiness, but we want to talk about the facts. The fact is that income redistribution has largely eliminated income inequality. Now, I'd like to go back briefly to this life expectancy business and talking about how government policy can have negative impacts. Well, there's the negative impact on making people also lose their jobs, or not lose their jobs, stop working. And also, if a single mother can get enough income to continue to raise her child without having to have a husband around, he's more likely to disappear. In other words, the government policies have driven the behaviors that David is talking about. We got to stop doing that if he wants that to get better. And yes, life expectancy has gotten worse. Or not, let's be clear. Relative to other countries, life expectancy hasn't improved as much. But the reason is we have destroyed the private sector research function. So those are the reasons why that is happening. But getting back to the proposition, has income inequality increased? No. In fact, it has decreased when we add all the data. Just saying that it was in some PhD's paper doesn't solve the problem. Because go look at those data I mentioned to you about doing the price indexes better. That was done by 3 commissions, each of which published more than 50 peer-reviewed articles to get to those numbers. But then the government didn't use them. Are we using the best possible price indexes? No, because the chained price index, the one I was showing you that meant that we had 50% improvement rather than 20% improvement, that is an official BLS price index, and Census Bureau uses it in the income data I was showing you, which shows that big improvement. But the rest of the government doesn't use it. So that's what we need to do, is we need to use our heads, but we can't just go around looking only at how many articles are published, but who did them, and did they include all the data? And the answer is no. In this chart here, we're including all the data. And we see great strides forward. It's not data that we made up. We added in the missing transfer payments. And today, only 2% of the population is living at a poverty level that would have been poverty back in 1967, because we aren't counting the 10 times increase in the transfer payments that have been given to people. So the answer is, has income inequality gotten worse? No, income inequality has gotten better, or is more equal. Has growth in income stagnated? No, this chart here shows you that it's increased. Okay, so where are we? We had a proposition that income inequality has soared, in fact, not just increased, has soared. We had a proposition that economic well-being has stagnated. But inequality has not soared. In fact, if you count the transfer payments from government data that actually exist, not numbers that Phil, Bob, and I made up. We just simply took them and added them in. This is not advanced mathematics. This is adding and subtracting first grade style. So we say, take all the transfer payments and add them in. And, oh, we'll take all the taxes. Well, perfect data on taxes in the government for state, local, federal. And we go and get all those data and we subtract those out. Simple subtraction, no higher math. And what happens? Income inequality declines, not increases. So I submit to you that if people are concerned about income inequality, it is really the income equality that government has imposed upon them by taking the money from those who work and redistributing it to those that don't. Not that there shouldn't be some of that, but it is so extreme that we have almost 20% of our population in the not working but still having a living income, and working and not making a whole lot more. And that is a sad situation, but that's not because of income inequality, and it's not because of stagnation.
Yeah, we now go to the Q&A part of the evening. You can line up and ask your questions. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to ask each of our debaters just one question. I also want to say that you are free to ask each other questions as well. You might want to wait to see if the audience asks one of your questions, but at any point you can step in and ask the other a question. I just want to start with my moderator's prerogative and ask John the following. It does appear, from what David has said, that he is he's going with he's sticking to convention. He's not trying to be an iconoclast. He's simply quoting from what the government says. They use the CPIU and quoting from standard studies, and you are the iconoclast. I guess the particular question I want to ask you is, if you were right, and you, I gather, have worked for government, why don't they do things your way? Why do they seem to do things David's way?
Well, let's see. First of all, let me take one story here. The story of what CPI do you use to deflate income. In the last 2 years, census changed from the price index they were using to the price index that we recommended that they do use. And that made the growth much faster than it had been before when they did that. I had the chart up there. It was like 50% versus 20%. So there has been some official use of it. So we were actually surprised when they did it, but they did it. But also remember where that index came from. It was also an official CPI from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It also was created by them. It was just using a better methodology, but no one adopted it except this one case for the one series at census, and Congress did it for the adjustment of our tax brackets. So that's an example of where, in fact, the change occurred. Now, the broader question of why haven't the changes occurred for the broader issues, I would say there are two. One is just plain old inertia. You know, they don't have to change, and no one's been putting pressure on them to change. And the other is there is I believe, a sub rosa fear that if they make those changes, then the pressure that they think they can exert to get more redistribution would be lessened, and that won't happen. Now, do the day-to-day runners of the program think that? No, they're just running on inertia.
Comment from you, David, on the question and on John's answer to that question. Any comment?
I mean, I think the bulk of John's statistics, he said that he did with, I think, Phil and Bob. And so I think it's worth reflecting on what you just said, which is it's not just that the government doesn't adopt these as its official measures. It's that these kinds of data suggesting that we don't have stagnation can't get published in the journals that are peer refereed by the country's leading economists.
Okay.
Well, actually, some of them have been. I mean, because if you read our footnotes, we're drawing on those papers. And these three commissions I talked about all had like 50 published papers on those topics, and we drew the data from those.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get to the questions, but what I would say is if you looked at my slides, they were full of notes. This comes from the Census Bureau. This comes from this journal. This comes from this professor. Nearly all of your numbers were numbers that you, Phil, and Bob put together, even if you cited other folks in doing it.
Yeah, well, we didn't put the footnotes there, but if you read the book, the footnotes have all the exact sources, the exact tables, the exact files of government data that we pulled together to make those numbers.
But if you look through the official government data and if you look through the best work being published in journals, you won't find the story that you're telling, and I think that's part of why the numbers you used didn't use any outside sources.
Have you read Myers and Sullivan's work?
I think that part of why you didn't use outside sources is that they're not consistent with the argument.
No, we cite Myers and Sullivan, for example, which use a slightly different approach, but get exactly the same answer we do.
My point is merely, and I do want to get to the questions.
Okay.
You may have a question for me. I think I would just note that in presenting my data, I used a very large range of sources. Nearly all the numbers you presented came from your own work.
But all were derived from hundreds of sources.
But I would feel a lot more comfortable in trusting them if there was a much broader set of people actually finding these results, rather than you're taking other results and coming up with ones that don't match what we're seeing in the official numbers and in peer-reviewed journals.
That's how progress occurs.
Question for you, David. John made a big point about work.
Yes.
He made the point that even at a time when jobs were plentiful, the bottom fifth, only 1/3 of them had jobs, that there's a real problem at the lower end with respect to whether you work or not. And of course, he was implying that that the government's intention to give people a hand and not a handout has simply not worked, and that government 10 times more transfer payments, is what he quoted, has caused disincentives to work, which has made for a huge problem. Do you acknowledge that problem? And if so, what do you propose doing about it?
Oh, I more than acknowledge that problem. I strongly disagree. I strongly agree with you, John, that the rise of non-work of prime-age workers is a major problem in this country. It's part of the stagnation of our economy. And we don't have to debate whether it's government overreach that caused it. I strongly agree. The rise of non-work is a huge problem. It is a symbol of stagnation in our country.
Well, but you're attributing it to stagnation. In that rather vague term. John is attributing it to the explosion of transfer payments that cause a disincentive to work. Do you see any truth in that?
So I do see some truth to it. I disagree with the relative cause, but again, it's not what we're debating. Our debate is not, has government overreach caused our economic problems? Be a great debate. I'm guessing in one of your 100 debates you've done something. You should do more. We're debating, have things stagnated? They have stagnated. The rise of non-work that John highlights is one more sign of the stagnation.
Any comment from you, John, on that?
Well, the non-work, fortunately, is confined to a small part of the relatively small part of the population. The innovators, the drivers of this economy continue to drive and move forward. So that the economy itself is not stagnating, but we have people who tend to stagnate and we get households without two parents because it becomes financially possible, even advantageous for them to behave that way. And when government issues adverse or perverse economic incentives, there will be people that take up those perverse economic incentives and not work.
Okay, question. Please phrase your question as a question and say to whom it's addressed, if any, to whom it is addressed.
Yes.
Go ahead.
On the one hand, I see that the difference between the top and the bottom earners is either 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. And then on the other hand, there's a feeling that the difference is like 10 to 16 between the two. So if I walk through a neighborhood where the average income is $50,000 and I walk through a neighborhood where the average income is $200,000, it is a 4-to-1 income difference, but you would say, well, these people probably have 10 times better life. You know, it's a weird number to put on it. I was wondering if you could just speak to why there's a difference in that reality of 4-to-1 and the perception of 10-to-1.
Why the difference in perception between 10-to-1 and 4-to-1? Okay, David, perhaps you can handle that question.
Yeah, so most of the work out there shows a ratio much larger than 4-to-1. John's is the work that suggests it's 4-to-1. And so to me, this is a case in which both reality and perception are much closer to 10-to-1. And the question is, John was showing statistics that suggest, I think at one point, that it's actually just 3-to-1 between the rich and the poor. I don't think that's reality. I don't think it's perception. It's because I think perception and reality match, and it's not 3-to-1.
Comment from you, John.
Yeah, it's a good question. But the first thing to realize is that those ratios are the ratios of the average of those quintiles, okay? And so within the quintile, the bottom quintile, there are some who have less than the average. And certainly in the top quintile, there are people who have more than the average. So there's variation within those quintiles. And so when you walk around, you will see that variation as well. It's just that you have to have some sort of metric to use, and that's an easy one to use. The other metric that we do have, though, that Gini coefficient that I showed, looks at the differences throughout. You know, the variation not only between the quintiles, but also the variations person to person within those quintiles. And that still shows that there hasn't been any increase in the amount of inequality. You know, think back the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. See, inflation adjusted, they are far richer than our current cast of rich characters is.
Okay. Next question.
So most people feel like they're doing worse now than they were before COVID. But if you look at income measures, especially across quintiles, it seems that even adjusted for inflation, average incomes have risen, and especially for the bottom quintiles of the population, they make a lot more now than they used to make during COVID, and that increase is, again, especially higher. The lower quintiles of the population have seen larger income increases than the top quintiles of the population during COVID, and I'm citing data from the Dallas Federal Reserve. And yet, if you ask people, they feel like they're doing worse. Everything is so expensive, you hear that everywhere. So I wonder how good people are at assessing how better they are now than they were 4 years ago.
People are saying they're doing worse, even though perhaps the numbers show they're doing better. Do I have that question right? John, would you like to address it first?
That's actually a fairly, I don't mean, it's a good question, but the answer is fortunately fairly easy because the literature on it is pretty clear. People think very short term. I know that it costs me $2 more per gallon or $20 more to fill my gas tank. I remember that. But I don't remember that overall I'm better off than I was 4 years ago. Or, I'm sorry, 8 years ago. Okay, I'm better off 8 years ago. But I think about the current time. So the current inflation really sits on people. They know about it because inflation slowed down, but prices didn't come down. They're still paying those higher prices for the eggs and the beef and the chicken and whatnot. And that's their short-term feel. They pay the groceries every week. If you stop and think about it, in fact, that's actually what started our project to write the book, was we were just reflecting on how we grew up with our parents and with our grandparents, and our lives are ever so much better. And not only ours, but our friends. And the rich kid in town was living not as good as I'm living now. And so we all of a sudden said, these numbers can't be right. So it's a good sanity check, but we went out and checked out the numbers. But short term, people will remember what's bad right now. And people are very bad at doing long-term comparisons.
Comment from you, David?
No.
Okay. Next question.
Hi, thanks again for the very interesting talk. I wanted to ask John about measurement. You used the top quintile, but wouldn't the inequality have grown far greater if you used the top 1%? Or if you looked at executive pay versus the rank and file, that ratio has grown substantially more than the quintile ratio. And then if you look at tax policy for the top 1%, that tax policy would even increase that after-tax inequality greater, and then debt burden, college debt and medical debt at the bottom, if you adjust it for that. If you adjust for debt at the bottom and look at the top 1% or the executive pay, I mean, if you used those measurements, wouldn't the income inequality have exploded?
Well, what about the top 1% and what about the debt burden? I guess that's addressed to you, John. Yeah.
Because there were a lot of pieces thrown in there. But that was part of what I was saying was like the top 20%, you could do percentiles. And do, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, break it into 100 pieces. And the distribution will become longer at both ends if you do that. It's just that is a convenient way to lay it out and to measure it, or to show it. But the measurement, the Gini index that I showed you about that, covers all of that variation, all the way from the person who doesn't work at all the way up through the highest paid AI innovator out there who's making trillions of dollars. So that captures all that variation. And you can slice and dice the data several different ways, and you get the same general answer. The proportion of income of people at the top 1% is not different than it was 50 years ago. The taxes is another one of those myths about what's going on. Actually, the proportion of taxes paid by the top 1% has increased over the last 50 years, not decreased. I don't know where that number came from, but that's the fact. That's from the IRS.
It's a really important question. I think you're absolutely right. when you look at inequality and you include the top 1% and the top 0.1% rather than just cutting it off as the top quintile, all the data, well, I shouldn't say all, you can always find some data, the data that the Congressional Budget Office publishes, the data that the Census Bureau publishes, the data that the Federal Reserve publishes, and the data and papers being published in journals like Science and top economics journals, all shows a very sharp rise in inequality when you were looking at the top 1% or 0.1% over the last few decades.
Not the papers I've seen, but okay.
Next question.
Do you think it comes down to just the cost of housing, that even though people are making more,
Housing, you said?
cost of housing and cost of college, because you're making a lot more than 50 years ago, but housing price has gone up by like way more, right? College cost has gone up by way more. So these make people feel worse off compared to 1967 or whatever it used to be. And second question is, do you think transfer payments don't make people feel better off because it's not the money they earn
I'm
themselves?
sorry, you only get one question, sir.
Okay.
So,
That's just the first one.
Professor, so you're talking about housing affordability and how that might be suffering. Do I have that right? That's your question? Housing affordability, the ability to afford a house. Is that right?
Basically, most people are better off than 50 years ago, but because the American dream is defined as owning your own home, right? Like sending your kid to college. And these things are just a lot less affordable nowadays. Does that explain
I got
why?
it. I'll take it. So, I mean, I think, so I showed you some data that show how people under 50 are much more grouchy about the state of the economy and the American dream than people over 50. And I think housing is very much wrapped up in that. I think when you look at not just what people say, but how they behave, it is harder to buy a house for someone in their 20s or 30s than it used to be. We see that in the data. And I think that is an example of stagnation in this country, that because net worth for most people, I'm going to hazard a guess that most of us in this room are doing a little bit better than the median American family, but because net worth for most people has grown so slowly, that is particularly why it is so difficult for younger people to afford a home. I mean, just think about it. You live in New York and you're in your 20s or 30s, try affording a home unless you make an income that is really near the very top of the income distribution. It's extremely difficult to do. If you're in your 20s or 30s, you don't need a 51-year-old like me telling you that it's harder to buy a house for many of you than it was for my generation.
Comment from you, John.
This time horizon thing comes in here again because the grouchiness of the 30-somethings today, if you go back, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but it would have been in the late 70s, that grouchiness was there too, because the business cycle moves up and down, and different people are affected differently. But the actual physical, real financial security and strength of the grouchy 30-year-old today is much higher than it was for his papa.
Okay, next question.
So, Mr. Leonhardt, you showed a graph that shows a decline in American perception as to whether the country is on the right path. You tied the decline to economics and stagnation, but how much of this decline could be explained by other factors like our perceptions as Americans of America's role in the world and our position in the world and our place in the world? So, for example, that period that you showed in the graph includes the 2 decades of the war on terror after 9/11. So how does that factor into the calculation?
No, look, I don't think the stagnation and people's unhappiness about it is the only cause of people not feeling good about the direction of our country. I think it is one important cause. And John has pointed out that the current levels of unhappiness with the country, John's pointed out a couple of times that they resemble unhappiness with the 1970s, which of course was a time of deep stagnation, right? Americans have now been unhappy about the country's direction for almost 2 decades. The levels of unhappiness resemble some of the unhappiness from the 1970s. There's a reason there. The 70s were a time of terrible stagnation. We're living through a time of stagnation now. I think the key is that when you also ask people specifically about the economy, you get really similar answers. If you say to people, how do you feel about the economy? They don't say, the economy's great, but I'm worried about our country's direction. They're deeply unhappy about the economy. They're negative about the American dream. That is consistent with the overwhelming bulk of economic statistics, as I've cited. And it's also consistent with underlying reality about things like life expectancy and measures of public health and family health. And so it's not that I think we should put perception over reality, right? It's not that I think perception matters more than reality. It's that I think the reality shows that we've had stagnation. And I think when you ask Americans, they say we've had stagnation. So to me, it's the issue of the evidence lines up on the side of stagnation, and I trust the American people when they tell us there's been stagnation, and I trust the other measures outside the economic numbers. And John, you're saying more like the economic numbers being published by the government and in these academic journals, they're wrong. And when people say things are bad, we shouldn't trust them. And all this other data about life expectancy and stuff, that's unrelated to the stagnation. And I think it all fits together. And it's one of these things of like, what are we going to believe? Some statistics or our lion eyes? And I'm going to go with most statistics, what Americans tell us, and the underlying reality of things like life expectancy and other numbers.
Comment from you, John.
Well, there was quite a list of stuff there, but we need to always found our opinions, how we feel, are important for us and for the polity, but we have to ground them in real facts. And the matter of income inequality specifically, the facts that the government puts out are wrong. And there is a substantial literature, which is cited in our book, and I didn't do that here, but a substantial literature that makes that argument in a number of different ways. But the big thing is, it's because the published data on income inequality is wrong. It does not include all the transfer payments. It does not include, some of it doesn't include taxes at all, and some of it doesn't include all taxes. And we went around and we got all those pieces and put them together and documented it. So David, don't you think that we ought to count all transfer payments when we're counting income?
Yeah, I do, but they don't show what
wrong.
Your data is showing, right? And I think if they did, your data wouldn't be the only place we would find it. We would find it in third-party sources. We would find it in published academic studies. And the only data you've showed us tonight, we're in the sort of realm of this debate, the only data we have to support your argument comes from you, whereas the data that I'm talking about comes from the federal government, the Census Bureau, the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve. It comes from published studies in academic journals, none of which are by me, right? They're by tenured economists at major universities. They come from what the American people are telling us, and they come from the underlying reality of things like life expectancy and other things. And so I weigh these things, and to me, the vast bulk of evidence lines up on one side, and your analysis, I grant that you have footnotes, and your analysis lines up on the other. Okay, and I'm going to take the bulk of the evidence.
But taking transfer payments, who has shown that all the transfer payments are counted?
The data I showed includes the vast bulk of transfer payments.
Who did it?
It's the Zuckman-Sias data.
Yeah, see, Zuckman, if you read his footnotes, doesn't include it.
He does include the bulk of them. And that's gone through peer review.
Well, okay, but all the others that you talk about don't. And the other Zuckman studies don't. I've read all of his books except this last one, so I don't. But none of the others do. And if he did, he wouldn't get those answers.
There's a lot of data, not just the Zuckman data, that includes the transfer payments.
Name me one.
The whole literature that is done by the Chetty Group on at the Opportunity Insight stuff takes into account transfer. But this isn't. You guys can't judge this. You guys can't judge this, right? So what we're talking about is we're talking about your work, right? No third-party sources, versus the Zuckman-Sias data, which does include tax and transfers. You can actually, if my slides say at the bottom, includes taxes and transfer payments.
Yeah.
And that's been published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Yeah, but Jetty's last piece does not address the question of the amount of income inequality. What he addresses is mobility, and in which he says the most important factor in a child's upward mobility is the employment experience of the adults in his community. In other words, if they work, he's likely to be upward mobile. If they don't work, he's not likely to. It doesn't say whether or not income inequality, his last work doesn't talk about income inequality directly.
My argument, I know we have more questions, my argument is your argument relies almost exclusively from the numbers you showed us on your work. Mine does not.
Yeah, but those numbers, we took the pieces and put them together. And all those pieces are published either by the federal government, or all the data were published by the federal government, and the underlying analysis was by like 50, in the case of the price index stuff, by 50 published professional journals. So
no one else has done the work.
Next question.
Hey, so if I just read, if I just read all of the data that's been provided, and I'm charitable to John, your evidence, basically what you've shown is that inequality in market wages has increased. And if you look at David's data and you look at the top 10% or the top 1%, it's especially clear. But then potentially that taxes and transfers have offset some or all of that. That may be the case, and it can also be the case that people feel very terrible about this because their perception is that they now have to rely on government transfers instead of a reliable job that came with health insurance, that came with other benefits, that came with stability. So do you think that this is a sustainable model to run our economy on? And if not, what can we do to try to reduce that market inequality that seems to be driving people insane?
Okay, you made a very clear, important distinction. The market, if you would, the earned income has become more unequal because, in principle, you can go no longer lower than zero. But as people who are more innovative and more driving and more hardworking come along, they keep pushing the upper envelope up. So there's always, income is overall always going to rise. So there is more inequality there, but what happens is we've increased our taxes such that we take more of the income that's increased and redistribute it down to people who choose not to work. And I wouldn't go so far as to say they're not allowed to work. They choose not to work. They've got the incentive not to work because they can get essentially the same income by not working as they would get by at least in their initial job. So the current government policies make it very difficult for us to keep these people involved because we're offering them a lot of money not to work. So that's one place where reinstituting the work requirement for getting welfare payments is very important. It exists only in a very small sliver of all the welfare payments. So if we reinstitute that, and there are the academic studies on this, show very clearly that when that was done with the TAMF benefits, that in fact more people started working and eased themselves off of the welfare payments and dropped out of poverty. So that's one thing that needs to be done, is to reinstitute those welfare payments those work requirements throughout the welfare payment system.
Coming from you, David.
No, let's get to more questions.
Okay, we have time for one final question, unfortunately. So, I'm sorry, didn't you just ask, was you the same guy? No? Sorry, I'm going blind. Give us your question. Go ahead, yes.
Okay, so David showed some statistics showing that, I forget if it was that people think the American dream is less possible or if the American dream and social mobility is actually harder to achieve. But I was just wondering, wouldn't it be more accurate if you portrayed like more specific demographics? Like I'll give two examples. Like let's say there's one kid who's like comes from a privileged background, and there's one who's like
I'm sorry, speak up.
I can hear.
there's one who's the children of immigrants, and like he comes from a more impoverished background. Like one of them has like a drive and the need to like work hard to survive, and one of them has like no ambition because no matter what, it's gonna be hard for him to like exceed his parents' expectations for him. So one of them is not really gonna make more money than his parents because he's not gonna try to, and one of them is gonna have a very good chance of making a lot more money than his parents if he works hard and studies really hard. And I think America has a lot of great opportunities other countries don't have that gives children of immigrants, impoverished kids, opportunities to really succeed and thrive and get into great colleges and make a lot more money than their parents did. And those kids are a lot more motivated than people who came from more privileged backgrounds. So if you included those demographics in those statistics, don't you think it'd be more accurate to see if the American dream really is possible?
Yeah, I think it's a great question.
I'm afraid we're out of time. David, in your summation, would you answer that? Would you be kind enough to answer that?
Of course, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you for the question. And you each have 5 minutes of summation. You can take the podium. You can do it from a sitting position. Okay.
I'll do it sitting, and I don't need 5 minutes.
Go ahead.
First of all, let me respond to the question. I think it's a really good point. And the two things I would say are, one, the exact issue that you raise has always been the case, right? There's always been a real gap where some people are going to have more drive than other people. And so it really shouldn't change the result over time about how people feel about the American dream. I don't think there's any reason to think that that today people have less drive than they used to. And so what we can see over time is people have become more negative about the American dream over time. And the mix that you talk about would have been an issue before and it would be an issue now. I think the second thing I would say is there's a fair amount of data that's on these questions where they split answers by income and by education. And one of the things that you really see is that the same group of people who've had trends that have been the toughest in terms of income, in terms of life expectancy, people without a college degree, people in roughly the bottom 60% of the income distribution, they tend to be the ones who are most negative about these things, which again is their perceptions fitting with reality. So thank you for the question. I mean, to some extent, I think you all have heard my summation during our question. I think to me, there are 3 really strong pillars for the idea that stagnation and inequality have become defining issues of our time. The first is that the overwhelming bulk of the evidence from the Census Bureau, from the Federal Reserve, from the Congressional Budget Office, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the economic work being published in the best journals by people who are getting tenure and going through peer review, work that does include taxes and transfers, as well as work that doesn't include taxes and transfers. And I think the question about whether we should include them is really interesting because people's market wages also affect how they feel about something, and they should. I think we all feel more proud of our market wages than we do after taxes and transfers. But even the work that includes taxes and transfers shows enormous stagnation of income and enormous rise in inequality. And then when we ask Americans, how do you feel about this? The survey data, and not just the survey data, but how they vote, who they choose to vote for, shows that they consider stagnation and inequality defining issues. I'm not saying that we should put perception over reality. I'm saying that when we're trying to figure out what reality is, are we simply going to ignore the opinions of the population? And I think the basic view of market-oriented people, and I'm guessing we have some market-oriented people here, is we trust people. We don't tell them they're wrong and that we know better. We trust them. And when they are telling us that stagnation and inequality are big issues, and it lines up with the economic data, we should not be dismissive of them, but we should believe them. And then the third big pillar is it's not just economics, and it's not what people are telling us. It is also all of the other data where we don't have to worry about these really wonky things like inflation adjustments and taxes and transfers, which still points to the conclusion. When you look at life expectancy, when you look at public health, think about that chart that John put up that showed how life expectancy in this country had been doing so well until the middle of the 20th century. We were doing better than other countries. That is a strong point of agreement between me and John. Heading into the mid-late 20th century, we were doing better than other countries. And since the mid to late 20th century, as you heard from John in his slide, and as you saw in my slides, it's a point of agreement between us. we have fallen behind. Life expectancy, particularly for the majority of Americans who don't have a four-year college degree, has stagnated. You put it all together, what does the economic evidence show, the overwhelming bulk of it, that's been published in places, that's been vetted by independent sources? What do Americans tell us? And what does all the evidence that comes from public health and comes from measures of social health? It all points to the same thing, that stagnation and inequality are defining issues of our time. This isn't part of our debate, but I can't help but mention it. I love this country. Like a lot of people, my family's life is basically owed to this country. My grandfather arrived in this city on February 26th, 1940, escaping the Holocaust. I think this is the greatest country on earth, and I don't think we should accept the kind of slow growth in living standards that we have had for most Americans over the last few decades. We can do better than this. Doing better than this requires being honest about our problems and then going out to fix them. Thanks again for coming tonight.
5 minutes of, thank you, David. 5 minutes of summation from you, John. Take it away. You can use the podium or
Sit here as well. David keeps referring to wonky data. I guess I'm a wonk, but I guess I'm a wonk. But I've lived with this data, these data for like 60 years, and I know the literature. And the argument that I didn't put somebody's literature up there is not an argument. Read the book. And even then, it's not an argument, because the argument is, what about the facts? What we did was very simple. It was not wonky. We said people's income includes the transfer payments, all of the transfer payments. If you get a check from the Treasury as a refundable tax credit because you didn't pay any taxes because you didn't earn any money, that is income. Census doesn't count it. And I can pretty well assure you that Zuckman didn't count it, or he wouldn't have gotten the answer he got. So what we did was straightforward, and we used official government sources for those data. We didn't collect our own tax data. We used the IRS tax data, and we simply added it in. It's not a mystery. And there are other people that have done the same thing. I just happened to mention our good friends Myers and Sullivan, who did this research and have published it in multiple places, where they did it, they used some different sources, but they got essentially the same answer that we got. So it's just saying dueling sources isn't the answer. The question is, should you put all those transfer payments in? Census does not. The Congressional Budget Office does not. It puts more in than Census does, but it doesn't put all of them in. We put all of them in. And we took out all of the taxes, because you can't spend the taxes. Tax data from the IRS, tax data from the tax agencies in the individual states. And then we just simply added the transfer payments and took out the taxes. Nothing wonky about it. And it got a very different result than what the official numbers are. And this won't be the first time the official numbers weren't right. And then there's the matter of the price index. We proposed using the so-called chain CPI, an official government price index that was created by BLS to be better than the old CPI, but is used only in 2 places for inflation adjustment and ignored everywhere else. So the data we have, it's all documented, we put it in there. So deal with the data. If you're not counting for food stamps, you're not counting all the people's income. So that's what makes it very important. Okay. Then taking a look at the matter of the slowing or the ebbing of growth, the growth in the economy and the growth in household income has ebbs and flows. In the short run, we've had some trouble. But up until then, it was growing gangbusters. Then we hit COVID. The recovery from COVID seems to be doing fairly well, except that, we had hyperinflation. Now, let me emphasize that the choice of those price indexes have nothing to do with whether or not we had hyperinflation, because they make only small differences. It's their cumulative effect over 50 years that's important. Both of those showed we had hyperinflation. So what I would urge you to do is just stop and think. Shouldn't we count all the transfer payments? Shouldn't we take away all the taxes? And then we know what the income inequality really looks like. Now, if you think 4 to 1 is too much, fine, make the argument. But don't tell me it's 16.7 to 1, because it's not.
John, okay. We are now going to go. I have in my hand the Solar Forum Tootsie Roll.
That's a inflation.
It goes to the so-called winner of our Oxford-style game. Please open your cell phones and vote once again on the resolution, yes, no, or undecided, the stagnation of living standards and soaring economic inequality have become the defining economic trends of American life. Yes, no, or undecided on the resolution. If you voted the first time, please vote the second time. Meanwhile, while you're voting, I've been asked to announce that in 2 days there's going to be another debate. Perhaps we should have had a debate about the election, which is coming up. Well, it turns out a young group of people who've been inspired by my Solar Forum, but who are slightly nutty in their own mind, that call the next to me. What? I can't hear you. Thank you, David. They are slightly nutty. Next gen debates, they're going to have a debate in which a libertarian group is going to defend voting for Kamala Harris and is going to be opposed by a libertarian. Next gen debates, that's where you can find it. It's going to be held in 2 days. Also, the Solar Forum will have a debate on November 20th. We are going to go south of the border this time. We're going to debate Javier Milei, the libertarian president of Argentina. We're going to have none other than 2 Argentinians who are going to go at each other about whether or not Javier Milei, the libertarian president of Argentina, has been good or bad for the country. December, we're going to have Glenn Greenwald, pretty well-known guy, usually packs them in, and he is going to be debating presidential immunity with a journalist who's written about it. The issue of presidential immunity, that will be December 11th. Go into thesohoforum.org, and you can buy tickets to them both. Both of our debaters are invited, given all the work you've done. Free tickets to you both if you want to come to those debates. You don't want to miss, of course, the Wednesday night debate about voting for Kamala Harris. So those are what are on deck. And also on deck, of course, is our after party. John, unfortunately, David can't make it to the after party. John will be there. There are copies of his book, The Myth of American Inequality, and he will be doing book signing and sales. I believe they're on sale for just $20 bills, John, is that right? That rounds nicely. Nice, yeah. Then $20 bills, and of course, David's book is also available on Amazon and elsewhere, but John will be making it especially valuable by doing book signing at our party. Follow me. I walk a little slowly with the aid of a walker. Follow others to 55 Great Jones Street, 2 blocks uptown where there's plenty of food and drink and stimulating conversation for us all at our after party. And so I invite you all to come. Jane, looks as though you have the results of the, now I'm going to read them, and I'm going to say the following. Oops. Yeah. Okay. All right. The yes vote, vote went from 30.5 to 32.2 and picked up 1.7 points. The no vote went from 42.3 and went to 45.7 and picked up 3.4 points. I have to say that was extremely close, almost a dead heat. However, David, I'm going to have to give the Tootsie Roll. John, okay. David would have given the Tootsie Roll to John even if he'd won it. But John, David, you didn't win it. John did. Congratulations.